Welcome to another episode of the 6Ps podcast. Today we're going to be focusing on Trevor Noah's memoir, Born a Crime. This is a bit of a cheat sheet, a bit of an evidence bank, where we're going to run through some important quotations and literary features that you should know when it comes to writing and analysing this text. Just to give you a bit of an overview of this particular video, we're going to work through the different key themes and ideas, and we're going to break them down into three sections, one with some quotations, one with some textual features, and then some points on authorial intent. Something to remember is that themes and ideas overlap and cross over. They don't sit in silos. In fact, I think in this case, most of the key themes, ideas, and values do overlap. So we are sometimes looking for flexible ideas that we can use across multiple different themes and ideas, because obviously we need to memorize these for our SACs and our exams. So as you go through this, if there's any examples, be it quotations or textual features that you think you could use across a couple of different ideas, then they probably are worth memorizing. When I think about the key themes and ideas in Born a Crime, I feel like the settings and apartheid and race, and I guess just apartheid thinking in general, are our overarching themes and ideas that we should know. And from them stem, I guess, some of the other ideas and themes. Now, of course, this isn't an exhaustive list of all the ideas and themes in the text, but I think we've chosen about 11 today to run through. Now, on the left-hand side, these are, I guess, the more positive aspects of the text. Again, these are shaped by apartheid and the atmosphere within South Africa at the time. So love and relationships, aspirations and dreams, religion and faith, education and language, and defiance and resilience sit there. To the right hand side, maybe some more negative ideas. So violence and injustice, poverty and class. I've mentioned religion and faith again because that can be both, I guess, a positive and advantage, but also can be something that is quite oppressive. We've got gender and power and identity and belonging, which similarly can sort of go between both these positive, optimistic ideas, but also can be quite destructive. But let's start with the settings. I guess the two sort of main settings we have in this text are Soweto and Alexandra, or Alex. So I focused on them. So we've got some quotations. Soweto was designed to be bombed. That's how forward-thinking the architects of apartheid were. There were only two roads in and out. That was so the military could lock us in, quell any rebellion. On page 26. And later on, if the monkeys ever went crazy and tried to break out of their cage, the Air Force could fly over and bomb the shit out of everyone. Another quote about Soweto is, there is something magical about Soweto. Yes, it was a prison designed by our oppressors, but it also gave us a sense of self-determination and control. So a more positive, I guess, depiction of Soweto. In the suburbs, everyone lived behind walls. The white neighbourhoods of Johannesburg were built on white fear. Fear of black crime, fear of black uprising and reprisals. Then we've got some quotes about Alexandra. We've got where Soweto was a sprawling government-planned ghetto. Alexandra is a tiny, dense pocket of a shanty town. And the last one here, Alex started out as a squatter settlement where blacks gathered and lived when coming to Johannesburg to find work. Another quote I might just add to that, it's got to do with Alex as well, from page 206. The hood was a complete sensory overload for me, but within the chaos there was order. And I quite like that quotation. A couple of textual features. We'll start with one of those quotes we heard before, the metaphor of being in the centre of a bullseye, which I guess is used to symbolise that his grandmother's home was in a highly dangerous and targeted area. And it underscores the constant threat of violence and destruction, showing the dangerous environment under apartheid. There's also some irony, because forward thinking, the quote on page 26, is typically used to describe something positive and progressive, yet in this context, I guess it refers to a brutal and repressive system which is designed to control and isolate people. And I guess this irony highlights a twisted logic behind apartheid's planning and its cruel and oppressive goals. We've got animal imagery, which is more often than not in literature used for negative purposes, but I guess this phrasing of, the monkeys and being in the cage is definitely dehumanizing, refers a bit to confinement, and I guess by comparing them to caged animals, it further, emphasizes the brutality of apartheid. And the more positive one is Soweto. And while it was physically a place of oppression and confinement under apartheid, the fact that it's quite magical could also symbolize the sense of resilience and self-determination. A couple of points of authorial intent. Through the settings, Noah exposes a stark contrast between different environments, showing how geography influences opportunity and survival. He challenges the idea that one's background should determine one's future, illustrating how setting can both be a limitation but also a source of strength. And we see that particularly in Alex and Soweto. And this last one, that Noah critiques the lingering effects of segregation, showing how spatial divisions continue to reinforce the social inequalities. And it's particularly pertinent when we talk about the cycle of poverty, particularly within Alex. Let's look at apartheid now, and we've got a couple of quotations here. Again, you could probably find about 100 quotations. Something I would definitely encourage you to do is with the PDF file of the book, the electronic copy of the book, Control F, apartheid, you'll see it sort of appears over 100 times. But these are a couple of quotes we picked up on, and some of these do appear in the prefaces, which is probably important to note as well. From page 3, the genius of apartheid was convincing people who were the overwhelming majority to turn on each other. Apart-hate is what it was. Apartheid was perfect racism. Apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep black people under total control. Race mixing doesn't merely challenge a system as unjust, it reveals a system as unsustainable and incoherent, from page 21. Later on in the text, one of the most sinister things about apartheid was that it taught coloured people that it was black people who were holding them back. Every year under apartheid, some coloured people would get promoted to white. Then from page 159, these people had been so effed by their own construct of race that they could not see that the white person they were looking for was sitting right in front of them. And that quotation, of course, comes from being questioned after Teddy's arrest. From page 240, because racism exists and you have to pick a side. And that, of course, is when he is in jail. We've got a few features here. We've got the historical document that begins the text, which is the Immorality Act of 1927, to highlight, I guess, the absurdity but also the cruelty of apartheid's racial laws, particularly how they criminalise personal things like human relationships. The fact that there is actual copy of this or an excerpt of this to begin the text also provides, I guess, a sense of authenticity into apartheid thinking and perspectives. We've got this, paradox of, or this juxtaposition of apartheid being described as perfect racism, as I guess racism is inherently flawed and quite destructive. The phrase perfect suggests a sinister efficiency in how apartheid institutionalised racial oppression, and so do terms like architects of apartheid, and that phrase comes up on page 49 and page 195. There's some symbolism around, I didn't write this down, but Nelson Mandela, the phrase from page 4 is, then apartheid fell, Mandela walked free and black South Africa went to war with itself. I've just mentioned that while Mandela is often a symbol of freedom and liberty, within this text, his rise to power does not correlate with better conditions for marginalised communities. The prefaces, of course, and anytime you quote a preface, you can reference this. They provide, I guess, the contextual information on apartheid thinking and values. And then, I guess, Trevor Noah then humanises those in the chapters that follow. There's some word choice from the page 120 quote, the word sinister, which conveys sort of that deep-rooted, deep-seated malice, showing apartheid's psychological manipulation. And even the phrase, taught coloured people, implies a sense of indoctrination and suggesting that division was deliberately instilled within people. And one more I wanted to mention was just the repetition and word choice. The idea that that's how a police state works. Everyone thinks everyone else is a police. So the repetition of the word everyone. And that phrase that everyone thinks everyone else is a police highlights the paranoia and I guess the surveillance culture under apartheid. And if you're going to talk about repetition of everyone, I guess it just emphasises how that distrust can permeate or spread across society. A couple of notes on the authorial intent. I think generally speaking, when it comes to authorial intent, you are pretty much saying that Noah condemns apartheid in some way, shape or form. And it's a matter of saying that, I guess, in different ways or targeting what aspects of apartheid he is challenging. But there are a couple of phrases there. One thing I wanted to raise that's not in that list is that Noah does critique apartheid's ability to pit oppressed groups against each other. There is a quote that comes up in the preface that Black South Africa went to war with each other. And the system not only created, I guess, inequality, but also spread internalized prejudice to sustain itself. Let's look at love and relationships, I guess a more positive idea to think about. Again, when it comes to love and relationships, we are focusing mainly on Trevor and the relationships that he has with, I guess, Patricia mainly, but also some of the other characters. So here are our quotes. We've got, she was always chasing me to kick my ass, and I was always running not to get my ass kicked. There was a genuine bond and love between my parents. I saw it. It's on page 26. My relationship with my mum was like the relationship between a cop and criminal in the movies, relentless detective and the devious mastermind she's determined to catch. Later in that chapter, page 82, our life turned into a courtroom drama with two lawyers constantly debating over loopholes and technicalities. That chapter, of course, is called Loopholes. I love the way they write letters to each other, very formal. And again, that's Patricia, I guess, teaching him the importance of speaking up for yourself, but also doing it in an appropriate manner. In relation to his father, he talks about, Trevor does, relationships are built in the silences. Page 262, part 3 here, relationships are not sustained by violence, but by love. That growing up in a home of abuse, you struggle with the notion that you can love a person you hate or hate a person you love. And the last quotation to describe his mother. She was my mum. She was my teammate. It had always been me and her together, me and her against the world. When it comes to textual features, I do like this cultural reference of Tom and Jerry, evoking a sense, I guess, of playful rivalry and emphasising both the conflict and affection they have for each other. That love-hate relationship. I do like the phrase, the simile, he was naughty as shit. It just reinforces his cheeky and rebellious nature, which contrasts with his mother's discipline. We've got the chapter titled Robert. This is, a few students have written about this. The fact that it's called Robert rather than father or dad highlights, I guess, what their relationship was like because of apartheid. They weren't really as close. Also, I guess the chapter titles for Affairs of the Heart, the three of them, they all provide valuable lessons for Trevor. Just a word choice here as well. I wanted to mention from the quote from page 110, where he talks about the relationship with his father was being built in the silences. And it conveys the idea that real relationships don't always need words. They develop through shared experience. And the contrast with the quote, apartheid stole this from us, time, highlights the broader social tragedy that enforced separation prevented genuine bonds from forming. And in this chapter, we see the micro to the macro, the macro being what's happening in South Africa, what the apartheid laws are, and the micro is how it impacts on individuals, particularly Trevor, of course. We've got the non-linear structure, which again refers to chapter 8. The fact that we jump forward in time to when he's 24 emphasises, I guess, his disjointed childhood without a father, which was forced upon him by apartheid thinking. There's some short sentences and repetitions, especially around that quote to do with me and her on page 274. It makes or reinforces their closeness, I guess. And the word choice I really like is the word teammate. It suggests an equal partnership rather than just a parent-child dynamic, and it reinforces how deeply Noah and his mother, I should say Trevor and his mother, relied on each other. The phrase against the world implies a sense of struggle and resilience as if their bond was forged through adversity. With authorial intent, Noah definitely celebrates the power of human connections and relationships, particularly those that provide strength and resilience. He challenges the idea that relationships must conform to societal expectations, and he endorses relationships that are built on mutual respect, trust, and understanding, rather than those that are dictated by social status or obligation. Let's look at aspirations and dreams, another positive theme we've got here. We'll start with this quote. I never understood why my grandmother had a driveway. The story of Soweto is a story of driveways. It's a hopeful place, and we'll talk about that symbol a little bit later on. If my mother had one goal, it was to free my mind. Someone plants the idea in your head, and it changes your perception. From page 188. The richer you are, the more choices you have. This is the freedom of money. With Mandela came freedom, and with freedom came McDonald's. McDonald's is a great little motif that comes a little bit throughout the text. The walls of apartheid were coming down just as American hip-hop was blowing up, and hip-hop made it cool to be from the hood. From page 207, the same chapter, cheese was always the thing because it was so expensive. Forget the gold standard. The hood operated on the cheese standard. And from page 279, my mother's greatest fear was that I would end up paying the black tax. I mentioned the symbolism of driveways before. They, as the quote says, symbolise hope and aspiration. Even though many people in Soweto didn't own cars, they built driveways as an act of faith, as if they were willing the car to happen. That's the quote, they were willing the car to happen. And I guess it suggests a sense of enduring optimism despite systemic inequality. And you could definitely suggest that the fact that Patricia manages to buy a car, a second-hand car, in the Q&A podcast we talk about this idea that it's both, I guess, a blessing and a curse, but it shows, I guess, the lengths that Patricia goes to. We've got the repetition of the word regret from the quote on page 143, which I'm sorry I didn't put in, but the quote is, regret is the thing we should fear most. Regret is an internal question you will never have to answer to. And that's from the preface on page 143. And I just suggest that repetition emphasizes regret's lasting impact. And the phrase eternal question suggests that regret lingers, shaping our choices and our aspirations. The imagery of McDonald's in a romantic moment suggests how Western culture permeates aspirations, making even small personal experiences feel significant. And McDonald's, of course, represents globalization, new opportunities, and the shifting cultural landscape. The phrase which comes up a little bit throughout the text of Black Tax refers to the financial and emotional burdens carried by Black South Africans to support extended families due to historical inequalities. The phrasing of break that cycle underscores aspirations for generational progress. I also like the juxtaposition of the phrase, the walls of apartheid were coming down and that American hip-hop was blowing up. It sort of suggests the cultural transformation alongside a political change. And hip-hop does symbolise empowerment. It gives marginalised communities a sense of pride and a voice when it comes to their identity. And I guess I need to mention this idea about cheese as well. It was viewed as expensive and a symbol for climbing the social hierarchy. Again, we've got our authorial intent there, but that first one, Noah champions perseverance and ambition. Forces that allow individuals to rise above their circumstances. And again, this is a very important theme and idea to look at when it comes to, I guess, the way that people overcome apartheid and their past. Let's look at religion and faith. I said it earlier, but it can be viewed as something that is both, again, a blessing and a curse. But we'll run through the quotations first, and a lot of them are from the first chapter. Like Indigenous peoples around the world, Black South Africans adopted the religion of our colonisers, and by adopt, I mean it was forced upon us. If you're African and you pray to your ancestors, you're a primitive. But when white people pray to a guy who turns water into wine, well, that's just common sense. And you've got that juxtaposition there. A longer quote from page 40, the chapter Trevor Pray. She believed my prayers were more powerful because I prayed in English. Everyone knows that Jesus, who's white, speaks English. The Bible is in English. Yes, the Bible was not written in English, but the Bible came to South Africa in English, so to us, it's in English, which made my prayers the best prayers because English prayers get answered first. And when I was talking before about how these themes and ideas overlap, this is where a theme like religion and language overlap. The next quotation, God answers your prayers, God is your father, he's the man who takes care of you. And of course that links in with the idea that I guess religion replaced absent fathers. Then she started to pray, and that's when the gun misfired. These are all from the last chapter. If God is with me, who can be against me? And Trevor, I prayed. I told you I prayed. I don't pray for nothing. I guess religion, when it comes to textual features, we need to start with the irony and the fact that religion was once a tool of oppression, and now it creates a sense of community within marginalised groups, which is particularly seen with the older women in chapter 3, Trevor Pray. You've got the single quotation marks around the word adopt on page 5, which is ironic, emphasising that black South Africans did not willingly embrace Christianity, but were forced into it through colonial oppression, challenging the notion of voluntary conversion and exposing religion as a tool of cultural domination. There's some word choice here. I mentioned that quote before. The fact religion filled the void left by absent men suggests that religion replaces what is missing, in this case male figures in the family. The fact that life centered on faith conveys total reliance on religion as a stabilizing force. And the link between absent fathers and faith suggests that religion is a social necessity rather than a purely spiritual choice. You've got the allegory of the different churches as well, reflects the struggles and privileges of each group. I would note that Trevor loved the coloured church. Yeah, I think he says, I had a blast in coloured church. He said he loved white church, but he talks about black church being a punishment and he didn't like it. And again, when we talk about apartheid thinking and how it infiltrates people's perceptions of race and racial classification, you've got the allegory there. Biblical references, I really like these. Moses parting the Red Sea, David slaying Goliath, Jesus whipping the money changers in the temple on page 7. These stories speak of individuals overcoming the odds and oppression. It's the little person against the big person. And ironically, given Trevor isn't really religious, religion sparks defiance within him. There's also the analogy of Jesus is your life insurance on page 285. Suggests, I guess, a transactional view of faith where belief provides protection. And the biblical reference, if God is with me, reinforces an unwavering trust in God. The question and answer structure of this passage highlights Trevor and Patricia's contrasting perspectives on religion. Where Trevor is skeptical, Patricia has absolute faith. And just that second point of authorial intent, I think, is one that I would look at, that Noah celebrates the strength that religious conviction provides, particularly in the face of hardship when it comes to Patricia. Education and language. This is probably the section of the text where I found so many quotations. It was really hard, I guess, to break it down into only a couple, but I've got a few here. We start on page 54. I soon learned that the quickest way to bridge the race gap was through language, and we'll talk about that quote a little bit later on. In my class, we had all kinds of kids. Most of the white students were pretty well off. Every child of colour pretty much wasn't. South Africa has 11 official languages. English is the international language and the language of money. On page 195. We weren't taught to think critically about Hitler and anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. We weren't being taught to think at all. It's, I guess, a critique of the educational system in South Africa. Same chapter, same page. The thing Africans don't have that the Jewish people do have is documentation. When you read through the history of atrocities against Africans, there are no numbers, only guesses. And I guess I didn't write this down, but you do have the comparison between Hitler and Cecil Rhodes, which is something you might want to look at as well. And the last quote here from page 236. Nelson Mandela once said, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart." When it comes to textual features, we've got the code switching that is employed throughout the text. So when Trevor and Patricia speak in a different language, Noah code switches to emphasize their adaptability and to humanize the story by conveying a sense of realism, which enables the readers to feel closer to the complex social dynamics. You've got the symbolism of language as a boundary marker or a tool that can either unite or divide. I mentioned before the metaphor of a bridge. It carries a symbolic weight representing a link between different racial groups, with language a connecting force. There's a biblical reference to the Tower of Babel, which alludes to the biblical story where language confusion causes disarray and miscommunication. I think they try and build a ladder up to heaven, but they can't work together because they all speak different languages. So by likening South Africa's linguistic diversity to this myth, Noah emphasizes the daily struggles of misunderstanding and disconnection caused by language barriers. A couple other things, I guess you've got the vignette of Trevor's experiences with Babaki at the metric dance. It juxtaposes his previous experiences with language, where it was a real positive for him. In this case, it's a barrier to him. Rather than bridging gaps, language creates a divide between him and Babaki. And you've got the metaphor of English as the language of money, positions it not just as a tool of communication, but a gateway to success in economic terms. The fact it's equated with intelligence once again reflects how English has been constructed as a symbol of intellectual superiority. Again, I found it really hard to break this theme and idea down a lot. You've got some other ideas as well. The fact in the school you've got the A class for the white students, the B class for the black and coloured students, again reflects that second class citizen notion as well. There's quite a bit that you can take out of this, but obviously Noah champions education as a pathway to empowerment and independence. He critiques the disparities in the educational system, but ultimately he celebrates language as a powerful tool for connection, for survival, and as well for social mobility, which is a really important point to make as well. And I guess the final, more positive theme or idea we're going to look at is defiance and resilience and rebellion and I guess survival as well. We'll start on page 9. My mother is as stubborn as she is religious. Once her mind's made up, that's it. Indeed, obstacles that would normally lead a person to change their plans, like a car breaking down, only made her more determined to forge ahead. And that's on page 9. Whenever the riots broke out, all our neighbours would wisely hole up behind closed doors, but not my mum. And I actually didn't add this in there, but I'll continue the quote from page 13. As we'd inch our way past the blockades, she'd give the riders this look, and it's in italics. Let me pass, I'm not involved in this shit. She was unwavering in the face of danger. That always amazed me. She was never scared, even when she should have been. From page 22, if you stop to consider the ramifications, you'll never do anything. That's from Patricia. We've got a similar here, page 23. At the time, a black woman learning how to type was like a blind person learning how to drive. She didn't believe in any nonsense about cats. This is where we see her defying, I guess, superstition. It was just another way in which she was a rebel, refusing to conform to ideas about what black people did and didn't do. On page 251, there's quite a few quotations here, particularly around Abel. The whole tradition of women bowing to men, my mum found absurd, but she didn't refuse to do it. She overdid it. She made a mockery of it. And that leads to the next quote on page 252. Don't fight the system, mock the system. I'm going to also do some more quotes from later on in that page, which I guess refers a little bit more to the idea of injustice. But there's a quote on page 256. The police refused to write up a charge sheet, yet she still goes back. She keeps going back. The quote, the police won't help me, on page 270. The government won't protect me. Only my God can protect me. And the fact that my mother jumped in front of the gun to protect everyone. And that's on page 276. You've got some symbolism to start with. I guess that phrasing of being born a crime, that Trevor is a symbol of defiance and challenges the status quo, exposing the notion of race as a construct and racism as unnatural, taught and enforced by those who want to perpetuate division within South Africa. The simile that she's stubborn as she's religious draws a comparison between her unyielding faith and her unwavering determination, emphasising how defiance, is part of her character. I like the question she asked too, why should I leave? That's on page 30. She says, you mean we could have left? This is Trevor. That was an option. And she said, this is my country. Why should I leave? And for me, that question underscores her defiance and demonstrates her assertive nature. The sentence structure of don't fight the system, mock the system challenges traditional notions of defiance, implying that mocking the system is more effective and empowering form of rebellion than directly fighting it. Also suggests, I guess, intellectual and cultural resistance rather than physical as well. You've got the symbolism of religion as an alternative form of power and defiance, one that is beyond the reach of corrupt institutions, and the italics in the phrase I'm not involved in this shit adds a raw, unfiltered tone and highlights her fearlessness. The casual profanity also illustrates her rejection of the seriousness of the riots and her refusal to be intimidated, and it really does showcase her no-nonsense attitude, which we see throughout the text from chapter 1 right until the end as well. And something to note, the symbolism I didn't mention there, in the text we have these bookended vignettes where we have Patricia facing violence and there being light at the end as well, and light obviously being the positive thing. We've got the light from the petrol station in chapter 1 and the light from the sun outside in the final chapter. And again, we've got some authorial intent, but obviously it's going to be pretty straightforward. This is one thing that Trevor Noah definitely celebrates and endorses, and that is people that stand up against oppression. So violence and injustice. Again, we're looking at the more negative themes and ideas here. I'll start with a quote on page 12. What I do remember, what I will never forget, is the violence that followed. The triumph of democracy over apartheid is sometimes called the bloodless revolution. It's called that because very little white blood was spilled, but black blood ran in the streets. On the same page, instead of uniting for peace, they turn on one another, committing acts of unbelievable savagery. That's when we're talking about the Zulu and the Xhosa people. Death was never far away from anyone. At any point, my mother could have been raped. We could have been killed. These were all viable options. Apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep black people under total control. I've got a quote about Abel too that I didn't put down here, but on page 123, Abel was big, around 6'3", long and lean. I knew he was dangerous. From page 157, following Teddy's arrest, it was a room full of silent, stone-faced white authority figures who stood over me, the young guilty black man. From page 270, the police won't help me, the government won't protect me, only my God can protect me. We've seen that quote already today. And on page 284, Abel pled guilty to attempted murder. He was given 3 years probation. He didn't serve a single day in prison. When it comes to sexual features, I'll start with the personification. The quote from page 158, I didn't put this in the quotes, but the fact that the camera can't expose for light or dark at the same time. So when you put me on a black and white screen next to a black person, the camera doesn't know what to do. If the camera has to pick, it picks me as white. My colour gets blown out. I guess that highlights the flaws of the justice system and the absurdity of racial classification. You've got the animal imagery. Abel is depicted as a cobra, calm, perfectly still, then explosive. He's also referred to as a dragon. These metaphors emphasise his explosive and violent nature. In contrast, Trevor describes living like a mouse in that house. You've got humour, which obviously provides comfort and protection following serious events. You've got the laughing after being thrown out of the car on page 17, and then shooting as well on page 282. The informal tone, the quote is, with the white person, it was more like, look, I'll just say you were drunk, but don't do it again, eh? Cheers. And that's a quote when it comes to he is taking on the persona of the police at the time. So Noah's use of informal colloquial language, look, I'll just say you were drunk, mimics the lenient treatment of white offenders, exposing the racial double standards in South Africa's justice system. And you can, I guess, compare that to Teddy, who got expelled from school for shoplifting, and even the fact that, you know, there was so many security guards that run after Teddy. I've got some word choice here as well. The repetition of what I do remember, what I'll never forget, is on page 12. I guess that emphasises the lasting impact of violence. The contrast between triumph of democracy and violence that followed highlights the paradox of so-called liberation post-apartheid. And speaking of that, it's important to look at the symbolism of the bloodless revolution, which is deeply ironic, as it suggests peace, but Noah immediately subverts this by revealing the racial disparity in whose blood was spilled. And even that phrase that black blood ran in the streets, it's a stark and visceral image that conveys both literal violence and also systemic and racial injustice. And obviously the authorial intent, Noah denounces the normalization of violence, particularly in communities where systemic oppression has led to cycles of abuse. And again, throughout the text, we see these cycles of violence and cycle of poverty as well, which leads on nicely to our next slide. So with poverty and class, we'll start with the quote on page 66. So many black families spend all their time trying to fix problems of the past. That is a curse of being black and poor, and is a curse that follows you from generation to generation. That's called the black tax. We've looked at that already today. The first thing I learned about having money was that it gives you choices. Cheese was always the thing because it was so expensive. Forget the gold standard. The hood operated on the cheese standard on page 207. We've got a couple of long quotes here that I'm going to read out. The first one is, Sizwe and his crew would never admit to being cheese boys. They would insist, we're not cheese, we're hood. Then the real hood guys would say, hey, you're not hood, you're cheese. We're not cheese. Sizwe's guys would say, pointing further up East Bank, they're cheese. It was all a bunch of ridiculous posturing about who was hood and who was cheese. And the quote on page 209, which I've got the start of here, is the hood made me realise that crime succeeds because crime does the one thing the government doesn't do. Crime cares. Crime is grassroots. Crime looks for the young kids who need support and a lifting hand. Crime offers internship programs and summer jobs and opportunities for advancement. Crime gets involved in the community. Crime doesn't discriminate. The next quote on 210, cash is the one thing everyone in the hood needs. From page 260, we've got a couple here. We've got I grew up poor, but there's poor, then there's wait, I'm eating worms. And as poor as we'd been in the past, we'd never been without food. And we're going to reference the black tax again. 279. My mother's greatest fear was that it would end up paying the black tax. That I would, end up paying the black tax. Some textual features. We've got this irony of being a cheese boy, the fact that it's aspirational until you get there, because you don't want to be labelled one. And this sort of perpetuates the cycle of poverty. A really common symbol that a lot of students write about is the CE rider. That I guess symbolises empowerment and materialism. It's the leg up that Trevor needs to succeed, that is not given to all marginalised groups, especially post-apartheid, and you can reference it in terms of the lack of government intervention. The metaphor of the curse on page 66 is a metaphorical way to describe the ongoing burden of being both poor and black. It suggests an imposed, unavoidable fate that spans multiple generations. And the personification and repetition of the phrase crime or crime cares, it gives it human qualities, making it seem as though it's quite kind and supportive, using crime to begin sentences, stressing that crime seems more attentive and responses to people's needs than the government themselves. When it comes to authorial intent, obviously Noah exposes the structural causes of poverty, illustrating how economic hardship is often the result of systemic inequality rather than that of personal failure. And I mentioned in the last point as well that Trevor Noah celebrates the resilience and creativity of individuals who find ways to survive and thrive despite financial hardship. Let's look at gender and class now. This is going to be our second last, our penultimate theme we look at today. I'll start with the first quote. I grew up in a world run by women. The house was in the hands of women. And the next quote, if you don't hit your woman, you don't love her. The next quote is about Dinky. It says, he was abusive, but not really. It was more like he tried to be abusive, but he wasn't very good at it. He was trying to live up to this image of what he thought a husband should be, dominant and controlling. And so many quotes here refer to, I guess, masculinity and the patriarchy of the time. 219. If a woman is being hit, people don't get involved. From page 250, Sangha culture, I learned, is extremely patriarchal. We're talking about a world where women must bow when they greet a man. The traditional man wants a woman to be subservient, but never falls in love with a subservient woman. He only wants a woman who is free because his dream is to put her in a cage. That metaphor is from page 253. Then we've got some quotes about the police. It says, he, being Abel, walked over to the cops and the station turned into a boys' club, like they were a bunch of old pals. That's when I realised the police who were not who I thought they were men first and police second. And a quote from page 270, they were pals, no charges were filed, nothing happened. Some short sentences there. You've got the metaphor of, this is textual features, the houses being in the hands of women. It reflects control and power, and it suggests that women had authority over the domestic sphere, despite broader societal norms that usually relegated them to the submissive roles. The word choice and the metaphor of, putting them in a cage is loaded with imagery of imprisonment and restriction. It contrasts sharply with the idea of a woman being free and symbolises how male desires for control eventually limit women, even if they appear to be valued for their independence. You've got the sentence structure there, of course, from the quote on page 257. The phrase men first emphasises the masculine identity as the dominant aspect rather than the duty to justice. That's the police, of course. And the word choice places gender at the forefront of their identity, suggested that their actions, behaviours and motivations, their interactions are primarily influenced by masculine norms and values. Only after their gender is established does their professional identity as a policeman come into play. We've got the comparison here of race and gender that's also sort of ingrained, and this reinforces Patricia's aspirations, bravery and courage as being quite extraordinary. Obviously she is, both in both cases, both from a race and a gender point of view, she's looked down upon. And the last, that last quote from page 270, sorry, I thought I put it down, I didn't. I'll read the quote again. It says, they were pals, no charges were filed, and nothing happened. That's 3 short sentences. It's quite blunt and direct, and I guess it highlights the inequality and the injustice of the situation as well. And you've got your authorial intent there, and particularly look at that last point when it comes to Patricia, who defies social norms and expectations, and the courage that she showcases to resist societal pressure. Sorry, that word pressure got cut off there. That word is pressure. The other thing I'd say is one more quote. Sorry, I didn't put it in. Page 39. As a nation, we recognise the power of women, but in the home they were expected to submit and obey. That's just another quote that you can use about the, the different environments in which women had to operate and the way that they were treated. Let's look at our last theme now. It's identity and belonging. And we'll start on page 53. Nearly 1 million people lived in Soweto. 99.9% of them were black. And then there was me. Cultural identity we're talking about here. Language, even more than colour, defines who you are to people. I was wanted. Being chosen is the greatest gift you can give to another human. That is in reference to his father, Robert. For all that black people have suffered, they know who they are. Coloured people don't. Since I belong to no group, I learned to move seamlessly between groups. I floated. I was a chameleon. The next quote, it's easier to be an insider as an outsider than to be an outsider as an insider. That's on page 118. Sorry, I didn't put that one down in there. I'm really sorry. What else could we talk about? Let's go to page 234. I put on this character, I played the stereotype. This is, of course, him being in jail. And later on, every time and every place I ever had to be a chameleon to navigate between groups, explain who I was. And the final quote here, page 272, this is Patricia. She never let me see us as victims. We were victims. The word were is italicized. Me and my mum, Andrew and Isaac, victims of apartheid, victims of abuse, but I was never allowed to think that way, and I didn't see her life that way. We'll start with the obvious metaphor again. It comes up a lot, this idea of being a chameleon or a cultural chameleon, that Trevor has to adapt to suit his environment. Obviously, a chameleon changes colour in order to avoid its predators, so this idea that he changes in order to survive. That's particularly emphasized in the setting of the jail. You've got the nomenclature, which is, I guess, the names. So the characters' names reflect who they are. So Patricia is she who gives back. Trevor doesn't receive a biblical name because Patricia wanted Trevor to be free and go anywhere and do anything or be anyone. You've got Abel as well. There's quite a few names, and Temperance, I should say too, Temperance Noah as well. A lot of names and meanings. It's very, Charles Dickens used to do that a fair bit. You've got the internal monologue. I felt like I belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That's sort of Trevor speaking himself. You've got the antithesis of an insider as an outsider and an outsider as an insider on page 118 to highlight the paradox of belonging. The tone makes it sound like a universal truth, reinforcing the difficulty of navigating identity in a divided society. One of the most common similes I use is this one. The fact that Trevor was thrown away or tossed aside like a bag of weed not only underscores the illegal nature of Noah's existence under apartheid, but also introduces a darkly humorous tone characteristic of his storytelling style. This comparison also, I guess, underscores the unnatural or the dehumanizing impact of apartheid laws. What else? I guess that italics, I mentioned the italics before of the word were on page 272. I guess that emphasizes the reality of the victimization and reinforcing that Noah and his family did, in fact, suffer under apartheid and abuse as well. And when it comes to authorial intent, Noah obviously challenges rigid racial and cultural categories, illustrating how identity is fluid and shaped by personal experiences. He definitely does challenge this idea and this notion of race as a construct, and it's particularly seen in one of the prefaces when they referred to the Chinese and Japanese people living in South Africa. He also critiques the societal pressures that force individuals to conform to narrow definitions of belongings, and I guess the suffering and that comes from that. So just some final tips, I guess. It might be really good for you yourself to create your own cheat sheet or evidence bank and try and locate unique examples. For me, what I really like is when I read an essay and I see an example that I haven't seen before. So if there is a character or a scene that you haven't seen before that you think is really worthwhile writing about, please add it in. Definitely use resources like this as you start writing your essays and then rely less on them leading up to SACs and the exam, of course. I hope you found this useful. I was hoping to make this half an hour, but it's ended up being almost 50 minutes. So thanks for sticking by, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the 6Ps podcast.